Certo. Sì, va bene. Ci va bene.
Buonasera, benvenuti a GiovedìScienza.
Good evening, welcome to GiovedìScienza.
Grazie a voi.
Thank you very much. This round of applause is already for Dalila Burin, who is our guest here this evening, which is also a promise, that is to say, to have a conference is part of the GiovedìScienza Science on a Thursday prize, which she won last year. In fact, it's not the only prize or award that she's won. She's won several, and then she won the GiovedìScienza Award, which is partly a contribution money for the prize, but also to show how one can communicate. Clearly, she had to give a conference to win the prize, but she also won the Aldo Fasolo Prize for Neuroscience. This brings us straight to her training. She's a psychologist by training. She graduated at the University of Turin, but then, and I shouldn't say but, because in fact there is a continuity. She then took a PhD or followed a PhD in neuroscience. In other words, it is a more in-depth, more scientifically oriented development, which was then further developed because in neuroscience you also have our brain, which is the rudder of our behavior, and there were a series of other problems and stories which were told in the material which were handed out. She got involved in neuroscience, but using virtual reality for rehabilitation and also to better understand people's behavior. So this development in modern research is quite common. We have a development of IT techniques and skills and other developments, neuroscience being one of them.
Una di queste. L'incontro con
The meeting with virtual reality took place during her stay in Barcelona, where she was thanks to her scholarship. She's very young. I'm just going to say that she was born the year the Berlin Wall fell. And before giving her the floor for the conference, I would like to ask her to tell us how she works. That is to say, what does she do? We have an idea what video games are, virtual reality is, but we're not quite clear about how they can be used to study in neuroscience and therapy. Well, please tell me.
Direi come quello di tutti i ricercatori, nel senso di tutti i ricercatori.
My work
Diciamo così, nel senso che si
is
parte,
like
come tutte le ricerche, indipendentemente
that of any researcher that gets their hands dirty. That is to say, you start regardless of what the discipline is with an idea. You have an idea or a question. The idea is that of establishing an experimental procedure to answer an experimental procedure. So the procedure is functional for the question, in the sense that it is a function of the question. Well, what was your underlying hypothesis? My basic idea is, and I will be mentioning it later too, is that our body is a key element are clearly in interacting on a daily basis, but there are a number of facets which are taken for granted but are not. Today, I will give you a few examples. Yes, I was thinking that possibly at the beginning of these basic studies could go back to Marais, who took some photos of people who were jumping, moving, and tried to understand how those movements were actually developed. We're talking about the end of the 19th century when movies were invented to better answer his curiosity. It wasn't clear, for example, what a horse did when it galloped. There's a moment when galloping, it doesn't touch the ground, but what about his legs? Well, it's Mybriggs, in fact, not Marin, who studied this. But now we are able to see what is happening in our brains when we move. It's no longer necessary to discover how our legs move, but how our brain moves our legs. And this can be a good idea when, for example, somebody who has problems in moving after a stroke, and you have to rehabilitate them. Just one more question before you start. Basically, do you create software? Do you create models with which then you compare data? In practice, what do you do? I also program it at a very basic level, in the sense because I'm a psychologist in the end, so I haven't got the engineering skills. Although in time I've learned how to develop very simple procedures in the immersive virtual reality, and I program themselves. I create the environment that can be more or less complex. I recreate the body that will have a certain number of features that tally with my study and experiment, and then I'm also involved in data administration and processing. So the environment that you program has to do with the specific case. Yes, virtual reality gives you the possibility of being modulated and tailored to the person's needs. In fact, it's very easy to adapt to the specific case. Well, fine. This is a first idea, so following this introduction, we can now hear your conference with any further ado. Thank you. I'm going to start from the beginning. As mentioned before with Professor Bianucci, I'm going to start from the beginning. What I'm going to be talking about today is an evolution which in many respects corresponds to my personal evolution as a researcher. My background is in psychology. This is the type of training I have, but my doctorate was in neuroscience. And the topic I will be discussing today is a combination between my background, that is to say cognitive neuroscience and neuropsychology, with a technique which is an innovative technique, that is to say immersive virtual reality. I want to start from the beginning, as I said. That is to say, the object of our study, bodies. If one wishes to study a body, it doesn't really define what it is. Here in GiovedìScienza, a few weeks ago, we had Damiano Marchi, who spoke about the evolution of the body from an anthropomorphic development with the discoveries in South Africa. And then we have heard people talking about the development of cancer. Whatever it is, you can talk about bodies in very many different ways. My approach, which is the one which pertains to neuropsychology and cognitive neuroscience, is to do with the awareness of your body. The fact that you feel that your body belongs to you is part of the identity of the self. It is quite clear how a body is the central part in developing our identity. We are also our body, and therefore it is very important in developing our mental image and the representation of our body on a mental level. And here, that leads us immediately to a number of problems. The first one being that inevitably a body is also the tool with which we experiment. My activities take place through our bodies. If we want to, for example, observe stars, of course we use a telescope, but we also use our eyes, and so we must know how eyes filter light, how they receive light signals. If we wish to experiment something, we have to be aware of the potential of touch in the human body. You therefore understand that when the tool is the object of study, when the two coincide or are consistent, there is a further problem. But there's also another problem that has to be overcome, and that is to say, how can you study in an objective, scientific, empirical manner something which is so subjective, such as the way in which you experiment your body, the awareness that you have? How can you study that in an objective manner? How can you measure it? How can you assess it? How can you assess something which is so difficult to capture? And this is yet another issue. For centuries, the study of what was awareness and body awareness were excluded from scientific studies, empirical studies, because there was no method, no scientific, rigorous method that made it possible to do that. Furthermore, Descartes didn't make things easier, dividing the res cogitans from the res extensa. Anything that was awareness was in the res cogitans, and therefore it was not the object of empirical study. Today, we know that this Cartesian dualism, this vision of the world, is not so true. And in fact, we have proof of it in our brain. In the brain, there is a map, a representation of the body, which is linked to the awareness of our body. We have that thanks to this map, this representation which our brain has of our body. You may have seen this rather unusual image, but this is the way in which the brain sees the body, both from a motor point of view and from a sensor point of view. Now, you'll see that this is a slice of a hemisphere of our brain, and on each one we have the map of our body. On the right hemisphere, it's the left body, and vice versa. As you know, it's the counterlateral side that the brain controls. This representation is rather unusual. First of all, it doesn't go from top to bottom. That is to say, it does not respect the image of the body. The various parts of the body are disorganized. That is to say, our face is near our hand while the leg is somewhere else. But not just that. The relative sizes are different. For example, hands, which you can see covers a large space in the physical world, is not so enormous. Certainly, a hand is much smaller than a thigh. At least in my case, that's true. While in the brain, it occupies a much bigger space. About 30% of all the surface is taken over by one's hand. Why? Because it's more sensitive. We have a great sensitivity, for example, on our fingertips, and it is more mobile. It can move with very precise movements, which, for example, your thigh is unable to do in spite of being bigger. This is the way in which our brain represents our body in itself. And it is thanks to this type of map that we have the personal or subjective experience that we own our body, that we possess it, and that we can interact in the surrounding environment. All okay up to here? Yep. Wrong. Wrong answer, if you all followed us, because it is not exactly that simple. I didn't lie to you. What I've said is absolutely true, but it's not merely that. In fact, the fact that you feel your body, that you feel you own your body, is a very multifaceted aspect. It's counterintuitive. We all know that we have a body, that we can move it, and that we can manage it. However, it's not that simple. It's not as simple as it looks. What I would like to do today is to convince you of this. I would like to reach the end of this meeting showing you how this experience can be altered, can be modulated, how complex it is, and anything but straightforward. And I will give you a series of examples, which I hope will convince you. As I was saying, the notion of the fact that you own your body is extremely complex and articulated. First of all, it is a modular idea. That is to say, it has a number of subgroups. For instance, this is my hand. These are my movements, and I'm aware of them. And that's three features, different features, three modules, all trace back to the fact that you possess or own your body. It is a plastic phenomenon. That is to say, it's not a static, constant experience which fails to change. Quite the opposite. It's very plastic, and it changes, say, while you're growing. Children are not as aware of their body. This awareness generally increases with age. And lastly, and this is the main focus of my speech this evening, of my presentation, it's that it can be altered, it can change. You can damage it, for instance, with a cerebral lesion. Case in point, what happens is that there are damages on a neurological level in the brain. Usually only one of the two hemispheres. The patients I'll be talking about usually have a lesion of the right hemisphere, and as a result of this, there is the left part of their body is damaged or impaired. The first symptom is aplegia, that is to say, the inability to move that side of your body. Following aplegia, though, you may have a series of symptoms which are more complex, such as the case of this patient that Oliver Sacks described in his book. I don't know if you've ever happened to read it. Please read it, because it's a very beautiful book. And in this patient, and in particular, she had a proprioceptive deficit. What is proprioception? It's the ability to perceive yourself. That is to say, to perceive your body when your eyes are closed, say. Even if I close my eyes and I move, I know where my body is. I know what I'm doing, thanks to this mechanism, proprioception, perception of oneself. In this patient, this mechanism had been damaged, had been selectively impaired. She describes herself as saying, my body can no longer see itself. It's a very detailed and precise definition, and it's interesting how this patient had only had that function impaired. All the other parts were intact. For instance, if she grabbed an object, she was able to perceive it, but she wasn't able to perceive her body holding the object. There are very many examples of these patients and lesions in literature and also in movies. This is Dr. Strangelove by Stanley Kubrick, which I'm going to summarize if you have never seen it. He's a mad scientist, and he's describing how the end of the world weapon is going to work and how he's going to repopulate the Earth. He's completely mad. He's off his rocket. But what we're interested in is his behavior. You will notice that his right hand behaves in a rather unusual manner. It seems to have a life of its own. It moves and acts in an uncontrolled manner, regardless of the will of the person. This that you can see in a rather excessive way, because of it being a movie, is the alien hand pathology. It is a neurological pathology whereby the patient no longer recognizes part of his or her body. Usually this refers to the limbs, upper and lower limbs, fails to recognize that part of the body as part of its own, so much so that he or she is unable to control it. And the hand moves of its own will, of its own volition. In this case, the hand is trying to strangle him. And it's not controlled by the person. In some cases, patients have very unpleasant feeling. For example, they would like to amputate this limb because they no longer recognize them as part of themselves. One last example that I would like to show you in this respect is a patient who was no longer able to recognize or identify her body as opposed to others. So much so that if a hand, someone else's hand, the hand of the experimenter, was positioned aligned to her body and her shoulder, and you ask the patient with her right hand to touch the hand that could no longer move, the patient touches the hand of the experimenter and is convinced that that is her hand rather than hers. What happens in these patients is that they remap in their brains, the corporeal description is altered, it's damaged, impaired, and this other hand is incorporated into their brain map, although it doesn't belong to them. It's embodied, that is to say, it becomes part of their map. It's a rather pervasive experience, and these patients are really convinced of this. And it's not only with words. They're not completely mad. In other words, they react, for instance, from a physiological point of view, if their non-hand, meaning the hand that isn't theirs but belongs to the experimenter, but that they believe is theirs, is threatened. They react exactly as if that hand were theirs and had been threatened. And this is a mechanism that also becomes part of the patient's motor system. So it's nothing to do with confabulation or speaking. It is something which develops within the brain. These are some of the examples I could show you. Pointing to the fact that you can damage or impair or alter the feeling that you have of your own body. This belongs or pertains to neuropsychology. You start studying the pathological conditions to gain an understanding of how cognitive development or operates. For example, if I take or cognitive situations behave. For example, if I have a nuclear magnetic resonance and I know that this patient has a particular lesion in a given point of that brain, then I can infer that this part of the brain is responsible for the function that is impaired. The idea, therefore, is to start with by studying the patient, but reaching some conclusions which can be generalized on the general and refer to cognitive behavior. Pathology is not the only manner in which you can damage or impair the person's perception of their body. You can also experimentally manipulate this function, create in healthy people conditions which are very similar, in fact, in some cases identical, to the ones of the patients which I've just described. This is the case of the illusion of the rubber hand. This is an oldish experiment procedure. It was described about 15 years ago, and it is old but still widely used, especially by me, and very effective. It really works in an extraordinary manner. If we did it here now, it would work with all of you, even on Professor Bianucci. It's rather amusing. It works in this way. One hand, an imaginary rubber hand, or the hand of the experimenter, is positioned consistently with the position of the body of the person, aligning it with their shoulder, while the real hand of the participant is hidden from sight, usually behind something or in a box. What happens is that once the real and fake hands have been aligned, you stimulate the real and the fake hand with two paintbrushes in a very synchronous and simultaneous manner, as you can see in the video. They repeatedly touch both the real hand but also the visible one. What happens? The brain is confused. The brain feels the hand being touched but sees another hand that is receiving the same stimulus. And to resolve this ambiguity, this mismatch, this sensory mismatch, the brain integrates these two signals and says, this is your hand, and this is what happens. I'm not completely mad. This is what happens. It's a very effective procedure, and at a certain point, you get the feeling that the fake hand, the rubber hand, is your hand. It's so effective that if, for instance, the fake hand moves, this movement is incorporated in your body image. I'm convinced that I have moved. But I will add something to that. If the fake hand is threatened, the person reacts exactly as if their body had been managed. Both in terms of behavior, there is a reaction, as would happen if I threatened your body, but also a physiological one. That is to say, a series of defensive mechanisms. So when we receive a blow, the first thing that happens is that you increase your sweating because, or you sweat more because you're frightened. The same thing happens in this case, although the real hand hasn't been touched. This mechanism is extremely effective also on healthy people, and it tells us how this perception of owning your body, you've seen this, how it is very easy to alter it also in a non-pathological but healthy conditions. The question now arises, another question, if it works for a hand, would it work for the rest of the body? From the rubber hand illusion to a full body illusion, and the answer is yes, that you can have a full body illusion because you can project, visualize the entire surface of one's body, and once again, with the multisensorial stimulation of visual and tactile, you can perceive your body as a projection, as if it were your own body. It's the same mechanism to the one I've just described, but it's a full body one. It doesn't only concern a part of your body. And this is where virtual, and in particular immersive virtual reality, helps us. It's a world that you can program with a computer and which basically simulates the physical world, but unlike the latter, it makes it possible for us to manipulate a virtually endless number of variables and to create conditions that we could not otherwise create. The other thing is what it makes it immersive. Basically, two mechanisms. Plausibility, that is to say, realism. It is a world which has to be plausible, realistic, or even though it's programmed, and also feeling that you are there. It's called presence, that you are there at that moment in that virtual body, which makes an immersive virtual reality a very effective tool. But you might think, after the rubber hand, that I'm completely mad, or simply that I'm overstating it. I'm going to show it to you. I'm going to showing you this clip. Few people who kindly offered their time as a volunteer, a bit like you did just before the conference started, and I'll show you what their reactions were.
Che cosa c'è?
Oh my God, it's a dinosaur. There's a dinosaur. Oh, look down. Oh.
Dove ti trovi?
She nearly fell. Where are you?
Sono seduto. Cioè, era perfettamente in piedi, ma sono seduto.
I'm sitting. He was standing, but he said he was sitting.
Nell'acqua.
Where are you? In water.
Schifata si allontana, no? Si allontana.
She leaves it. She's disgusted. Rather odd.
Nello spazio, immagino, non lo so. Ciao.
I'm in space somewhere. Hi. Interacting with an alien. In fact, there's a T-Rex which is coming towards me. She moves back.
Si scansa. Cioè si è spostato per far passare la gamba. Ti è passato sopra?
He moves to allow the T-Rex to move. Did he walk over you? So if you look down, can you see your hands?
Ma sei sott'acqua col tuo corpo?
Hands.
Con le tue gambe?
Are you underwater? Is your body underwater? Yes. And your legs? Got shoes like mine.
Anche qui vedete passa il dinosauro, si scansa perché
Once again, you see the dinosaurs just gone by.
Un dinosauro enorme.
It looks as if we're in a submarine. An enormous dinosaur's coming towards me. Oh my God. Where are you?
Avete visto quel coso tipo le è andato incontro e lei si è scansata. Sei nello spazio.
Where are you?
È nello spazio lui.
Are you in space? Yes.
Anche lui interagisce con l'alieno. Vedi il tuo
I think there's
stesso
an
corpo?
alien there.
Sì. Gambe.
Can you see your body?
La mano
Yes.
un po' si muove.
Legs, hand is moving.
Dove ti trovi?
Sott'acqua.
Sott'acqua. Lui è sott'acqua.
Where are you? Underwater.
Anche lui guardate il passaggio del dinosauro, si scansa. per far passare la gamba del dinosauro.
Looking at the dinosaurs, allowing the dinosaur to go past him.
Se n'è andato?
Sì.
She's covering her eyes.
Questa è la tua ombra?
Is he gone?
Vedete che c'è l'ombra.
This is your shadow. Can you see there's a shadow?
Si muove. Hai anche le
It's
gambe?
moving. Your head's moving.
Anche le gambe.
Your legs?
Ok.
Yes, I can move my legs too. I can move all of my body. A bit disgusting, a bit
Dove ti
frightening.
trovi? Nello spazio.
Where are you?
C'è il sole.
Space. Sun's out.
È fatto veramente bene, dice.
Well made. Well
Insomma, avete
made.
visto, sono giusto qualche così giochino, fondamentalmente io lo faccio perché mi
So
diverto.
you've
ecco,
seen,
dico,
these are but a few games. I do it because I enjoy it. I have fun. But to give you an idea of the feelings that people have when they are immersed in the virtual world. Plausible. You've seen reaction that people had. People move when the dinosaur goes by, not to be squashed. The dinosaur clearly doesn't exist. It only exists in this virtual world, but which our brain interprets as if it were true. Virtual reality, immersive virtual reality, offers us a vast range of possibility which exceeds the limits of the physical world, because we have limitations because of this, and it gives us the opportunity to create environments, contexts which go beyond the real world, the physical world's experience. What we can do is, as we were saying before, we can create virtual environments which can be beautiful, big, small, or they could be open air or small, recreating, for example, just a room. But above all, you can have a virtual body. You can manipulate this virtual body, which we perceive as something which belongs or pertains to us. I was saying that in this virtual world and in this virtual body, you can do a number of things which otherwise you could not create. For instance, in an immersive virtual reality, you can go back to being a child. My virtual body, which is an avatar, known as an avatar, could be a little girl. And the fact that you are a little girl and have a little girl's body will generate a series of cognitive modifications, and I will behave as such. For example, we know that children perceive the objects around them as being bigger than they are. This is what we did in this study. When people are immersed in this child's virtual body, they react overestimating the size of objects, just like children do. Another case in point is the manipulation of your body's features. I am white, but my avatar could be black or vice versa. The extraordinary thing is that this illusion, the fact that you have this virtual body which is black or with different features, leads me to change a series of social behavior patterns. For instance, if you embody yourself in a black avatar, reduces a racial bias. I'm not talking about racism. A racial bias is a cognitive function. So, for instance, if I have a white and a black face, I answer more quickly to the white one because I too am white. Just as if I had a woman and a man's face, I react more quickly to a woman's because I'm a woman. It has a cognitive function which has nothing to do with racism, but it is a very high-level feature. And so this is how we can say that the fact that if you perceive a different body and with different features may also impact on high-level functions, not only cognitive but also social ones. The fact that you have a virtual body, which can be altered, manipulated, may have an impact in cognitive terms or social terms, but also, which is even more important for, as far as my work is concerned, may also have a motor impact. What I'm going to be describing to you now is the very first study which I've carried out in an immersive virtual reality, an immersive VR. And in the course of this study carried out on healthy patients was to immerse a person in a virtual world, in a virtual body which can be visualized with the same perspective or as a third person. So you can see the body as your own, consistently with your own, or sitting opposite. So with a different perspective as a third person. What we asked people to do is to trace vertical lines in a continuous and constant manner, while the virtual body was writing ovals. This is the performance, while this is what the virtual body was doing. They were ellipses, ovals. What we found at the end of our study is that people tended to copy the movements of the avatar. Instead of generating vertical lines, they too were drawing ovals, and they were drawing ovals, copying the pattern of movement, replicating the same movement as the virtual body, but only when it was perceived as your own. That is to say, when it was seen from a first-person perspective. What does this tell us? What does this study tell us? That even in healthy people, people who do not necessarily have a pathology, the virtual body may have objective consequences on people's body from a social point of view, a cognitive point of view, and a motor point of view. Summarizing so far, we have seen that in an immersive virtual reality, we can do things which are not possible in the physical world. You can do all the things that you can imagine and more than that. In the immersive VR, you can have a virtual body and you can perceive it as your own. This virtual body can be manipulated. It can be altered experimentally, and such manipulation has a measurable effect on people's bodies. If maths is something certain, this means that immersive VR, on the basis of what I've said so far, gives us enormous possibilities in a clinical setting for rehabilitation. For instance, say that you have a patient, such as the ones which I described, that say following a cerebral lesion, a hemorrhage, a trauma, a stroke, whatever, is unable to move part of his or her body. Now imagine the same patient is in a virtual reality and is in his or her virtual body and sees its avatar moving the parts of their body which in fact in reality they can no longer move. This is what we're doing to try and understand how we could use these opportunities to improve rehabilitation from a clinical point of view. First of all, we know that by projecting this virtual body with a first-person approach, if I see myself and I can see my body, which is consistent with mine, I already get the feeling that that body belongs to me. Visual stimulation in itself is enough to stimulate that feeling I was mentioning earlier on, that is, you possess or own your body. You remember the rubber hand illusion? Well, in that procedure, there had to be two channels at the same time, tactile and visual, so that the illusion was complete. In this case, the mere visual stimulation is sufficient because immersive virtual reality is a very effective tool. The fact that you have a virtual body that you can see and that is positioned consistently with mine, that in itself generates the identification, which means that you feel you own your body. But if to that I also add the tactile one, then it increases. For instance, if on the physical, real body of the person, we stick small vibrotactile stimulators, which we call vibrins. That's not, I don't know how to call them, but we call them, we should ask the president of the Italian Language Academy, the Accademia della Crusca, what we could call them. In any case, they're small vibrotactile stimulators, and they generate a vibration when resting on the body. So imagine this resting on the back of the person. You see that in the virtual world there is this virtual stimulator, and at a certain point it touches the back of the avatar in the same point in which we have the vibration. What happens? Well, when the two touch each other, the vibrator is activated, and I can see the stimulation on the body, which is in front of me, and I feel it on my body, just like the rubber hand. There's this match or mismatch. It's a sensory mismatch, so much so that the conflict comes to an end by saying, that is my body. And people perceive themselves as if they were shifted, projected forward, closer to the virtual body, the avatars. If tactile and visual stimulation is completed by motor stimulation, then I assure you that it's extremely effective. That is to say, if the movements of the real body correspond to those of a virtual body, I assure you that the feeling that you own that body and its movement is very, very strong. In fact, it's very, very difficult to eliminate it. It's very difficult to find situations where this does not happen. But to do this, it's necessary to have a system which tracks, measures the position of one's body in space and reproduces online on the virtual body all its movements. I was saying that this is so strong that even if we were sitting completely immobile, but our virtual body were walking in this virtual environment, we would get the feeling that we were walking. This is what was done in a study that was recently published with this same approach, where this virtual body, the participant, is absolutely sitting down, not immobile, absolutely immobile, sitting down on a chair, but gets the feeling that his virtual body is moving. So not only does he have the feeling that his body is moving, but at one point the avatar climbs up a hill. And while this happens, on the real body of the person, there is an increase of temperatures, of production of sweat, and also of heart rate, as if the real person were climbing up a hill. This mechanism is being used for the functional recovery of movements that have been lost, especially in the lower limbs. In this case, if this mechanism works on healthy people, so the idea is that we could use them in people who could have lost or partly lost the ability to walk. The idea is that the repeated exposure to that virtual movement will trigger the same mechanisms that are activated when we walk in the patient's brain. And likewise, the same approach can be also used for the upper limbs. In this case, the idea is to learn from your virtual body. We know, for instance, that the knowledge acquired from by one hand is transferred also to the other, because it is true that the right hemisphere controls the left half of the body and vice versa, but the two hemispheres communicate. So if my right hand learns a sequence of tapping, when I have to do the same task with the other hand, I will be faster in learning it because my brain has already learned it and has transmitted this knowledge to the other side of the body. Now, if you imagine this mechanism applied to our hypothetical patient who is unable to move his or her hand, this patient will see his virtual body with that exercise with his virtual left hand.
Mi aspetto che lui sia più veloce e più bravo nell'eseguire quel compito proprio perché ha imparato dal suo corpo virtuale. Badate bene che questo meccanismo di apprendimento è un meccanismo che c'è.
This learning mechanism exists under any circumstance. For example, if I were observing someone else performing that movement, clearly I would learn it. But in this case, it's not merely observing someone else performing a movement, but it's a matter of observing your virtual body performing it. We know this, and it's a well-known mechanism. If you learn something by observation, it's one thing, but if you learn it by doing, it's something else. You tend to be better in learning tasks when you do it rather than merely observing it. This is the principle of this mechanism. That is to say, to exploit this to recover lost movement. The idea is that you trigger the mechanism in the brain, which is plastic, so as to activate these mechanisms, which are mechanisms of motor learning that can stimulate the pelagic limb, the limb that doesn't move, and that there may be a stimulation to move it. So the question is, how do we know that all this works? How do we know that there has been an improvement or a change, and that this change is significant, and that there has been a result? In other words, how can we translate something which is so subjective, something which is linked to our experience, such as this feeling that you own your body? How do we translate it into something measurable? Another big advantage of immersive virtual reality is that it makes it possible for us to carry out measurements online, that is to say, while the body is immersed in VR. For instance, physiological measurements. You can measure
cardiaco, la temperatura. Si possono prendere
Heart
anche
rate,
di tipo
temperature,
chirurgico, per esempio
perspiration. You could also carry out kinematic measurements on speed, on movements, or on the strength, if, say, you're grabbing an object. But we can also have direct measurements of the brain's electrical activity with an electroencephalogram by measuring the EEC, which is compatible with the visor that you have to project VR. You can have a direct measurement of the electrical activity of the cortex as a response to a visual stimulus while the virtual body is performing a series of movements. As in any other rehabilitation, this too has a series of sessions. The idea is that repeated exposure to training in immersive VR will give an outcome in the long term that is an improvement of those functions which are treated in the virtual body. Once again, to see the effectiveness of treatment, as you would do with any other rehabilitation, is that you give the patients a series of tests just before and just after training. The aim is clearly to identify change and improvement in the post-training phase, and thus to test the effectiveness. This is the end of my presentation, and I thank you very much for listening.